Yes, but I'd first like to just thank you. I salute you. I salute my dear sister Farrakhan, the co-chair there in Michigan. You all are working so very, very hard, very much so. I want to thank Brother Mark as well, and I want to thank Brother Abdullah as well. And I think my magnificent running mate is here, Sister Melina, Dr. Abdullah, who has a long and rich history in the struggle for freedom on behalf of oppressed peoples all around the world, but beginning on the chocolate side with the Black Lives Matter movement. But for me, it's always been a question of trying to accent the moral and spiritual dimension of any struggle for freedom. Yeah. That I come out of a tradition that's deeply shaped by Martin Luther King Jr. on the one hand, Malcolm X on the other, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker on the one hand, and artists, which mean very much to me, the Nina Simones and others on the other. And this was something that began very young for me, my dear sister, that we shut down Sacramento when I was 13 years old. That's when Martin Luther King Jr. was shot down like a dog on that porch in Memphis. And that was 1968. And you're absolutely right. By the time I went to college, I was working with the Black Panther Party, not a member of it because I was a Jesus-loving free black man. They were atheistic and secular. So we had overlap, but I take Jesus with me everywhere I go. And therefore, we work very closely together because we zeroed in on the least of these, the poor and the degraded and the subjugated. Working in prisons. I've been blessed to work in prisons for 51 years now, and we worked in breakfast program as well. And you're absolutely right. By the time I went to Union Seminary, where I teach now, that was in 1977. I was 23 years old, and I met the towering Edward Said, and he, and Noam Chomsky, and Iqbal Amal, who was a Pakistani brother who was very close to Edward. We used to march in front of the New York Times just to get them to use the word occupation. And they thought that was anti-Semitic, and they thought back then, this is how sick and ridiculous the discourse has been for so very, very long. And so I've just tried to be constant. I've tried to be consistent in my moral witness and in my spiritual witness. And most importantly, you try to be courageous. Because when you tell the truth, and the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, you're going to get so many lies coming at you. And the lies are just hiding the crimes. The crime has been in place for a long, long, long time. And that's in relation to not just the genocide right now taking place in Gaza or the occupation or the apartheid-like conditions or ethnic cleansing, but it's true in the United States as well. Anybody who tells the truth about the vicious legacy of white supremacy has to get ready to die. That's my tradition. That's where I come from. You see, that goes all the way back to the beginnings of the struggles against slavery, the struggles against neo-slavery, known as Jim and Jane Crow and so forth. So you're not surprised at that. You're not surprised by any form of evil. You're not paralyzed by despair. But at the same time, you have to be in solidarity with others. And so for me, it could be El Salvador, it could be South Africa. I'm blessed to work with Mandela and Bishop Tutu. We are now actually mourning the great James Morris Lawson Jr. I just had a radio show this morning, 95 years old. He was the brother who invited Martin Luther King Jr. to Memphis. He was pastor of the Methodist Church there. His students were Diane Nash and Marion Barry and John Lewis and James Bevel. We can go on and on and on. I've been very blessed in my life to meet some of the most magnificent freedom fighters of all colors. Disproportionately chocolate, though, but of all colors, because it's always embraces all, but it begins at home. It begins at home. And so who would have thought that we'd see this ripping of the veil with all of the lies about liberty and freedom, and we see genocide, and we see ethnic cleansing. It's been there for a long time. Zaid and others from 1979, when he wrote The Question of Palestine, he was making the same point. What does it take to rip off the veils and show the truth beneath the lies, and the lies hiding the crimes? Most importantly, I think we have to have a solidarity with each other, but we have to always accent the moral and the spiritual dimension of this thing. You see, I do not enter politics as a politician. I've been running for justice for 50 years. Just like
Dr. West, we did just get a question along those lines, and so I'm going to pose it to you here. The questioner was anonymous, but they say, unfortunately, young people have been leaving the church in droves in recent years. However, contrary to what one might think, the fastest growing group is not atheists, but rather those who believe in God but do not follow a particular religion. This seems to be directly related to the dominance of the political right in Christian spaces and religious spaces in general. What opportunity do you see in this for the religious left at large and the Christian left in particular? How pertinent is it for the left to recapture the church? And I will get to your running mate, Dr. Abdullah, who's a Muslim, and also draws heavily on her spiritual grounding in the Muslim faith.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I appreciate the question. I don't know who it is, but I just thank you, my dear sister, for reading it, though. Because you see, when I talk about accenting the moral and the spiritual, it's in no way confined to institutional religion. Most institutional religion accommodates itself to empire and white supremacy and other forms of domination, you see, through predatory capitalist processes and so forth. And even as a secular person, Angela Davis is my dear sister. She's secular to the core, just like Huey Newton was, just like Bobby Seale was, and still is. He's still living, God bless him. But they still have a moral and spiritual dimension to them. It's just that it's not tied to God talk. It's not tied to theism. It's not tied to a belief in God. But I do believe that in a moment in which organized greed and weaponized hatred and routinized indifference to the vulnerable is becoming so pervasive and predominant everywhere you look. And what does that do? It suffocates all forms of morality, all forms of spirituality. And it's just survival of the slickest, survival of the richest, survival of the most powerful. And that's nothing but gangsterization of the world. That's what gangsterization is. And one reason why Trump is so popular is because he's not just a sign and symbol. He enacts and embodies the highest levels of gangsterization. What do gangsters do? They say and do anything without accountability. They're tied to their own narcissism, their own sense of power, and the very notion of morality and spirituality is totally alien. And we're seeing that not just in his behavior, we're seeing that across the board. And that's a sign of an empire in profound spiritual decay and moral decadence. And we have to be able to reintroduce America to the best of itself. And for me, that begins with the Black freedom movement. It begins with the struggles against capitalism, white supremacy, and so forth. And especially the imperial tentacles of the larger hyper-capitalist project that America is, or empire, let's just call it empire, as it were. So that I think it's really healthy when people see institutional religion selling out the forms of domination and leave, but still preserve their moral and spiritual dimensions.
Right. Yeah. Dr. West, can you speak just a little bit about your VP pick, Dr. Abdullah, and why you picked her as your vice presidential candidate?
Yeah, well, when I sat down and prayed and had wonderful conversations with my beloved wife, Anahita, we had reached the conclusion that we wanted a vice presidential candidate who would put a smile on the face of Fannie Lou Hamer and Martin King and Malcolm X and Ella Baker, ... You see, that's the criteria. That's what moral and spiritual greatness is. The courage and compassion and service to the least of these and willingness to pay a cost. And that she exemplifies that. She's been at this now for decades and decades. And then, you know, the various attacks on her, the SWAT teams coming through her place, Every Wednesday for the last number of years, she's there to make sure that folk who have been brutalized by the police or families who are tied to the murder by the police are comforted, are supported. And see, that to me is the most important thing when it comes to politics, moral and spiritual greatness in the form of courage and compassion. And that's why it's just so sad. You got most of the politicians today who can't even mention the word ceasefire until the boss on the plantation says it. That's just a sign that they don't have a moral and spiritual connection to the suffering. It's just an electoral strategy based on Machiavellian calculation.
Right. That's
the worst thing for me. It's just so sick for me. It really is.
That's one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, because we have been able to kind of galvanize to a certain extent. I mean, of course, the effectiveness of calling for a ceasefire, we haven't seen it, and it's been months. But if it's not coming from a moral and spiritual stance, then who's to say that a group of people who have even less support are not going to be the next ones in the crosshair? And if nobody's standing up for them, then it's just their lives are up for grabs, right? So it should be coming from a moral, spiritual stance, as opposed to popularity or coming from the top, or an order coming from the top down.
Absolutely.
One of the questions we've been getting a lot of questions about unity amongst the left. I will read out a question that Drew Austin had written in. He said, Daruba bin Wahid and the Black Power media had issued a call to these three amazing candidates and the people to form a united front against fascism. I myself had watched that conversation of yourself on the Black Power Media platform. He said, let's form a unified movement, an independent Green Party for socialism and liberation. The PSL is the vanguard of the mind. Dr. Cornel West is the vanguard of the heart, and the Green Party is the vanguard of the body. We have to join forces and put PSL in the driver's seat, Cornel in the passenger seat as vice president, and use the Green Party's infrastructure and ballot access as the engine. He said, we must leave behind traditional campaigns and form a revolutionary movement now before the unprecedented opportunity of 2024 goes to waste. I will say this, the question that I would like to ask here is, I understand that there is a popular belief that voting for third parties leads to, numerous times third party voting has been blamed for the Democratic Party losing the elections. And I think that is a misplaced belief, because there are many people who show up to vote third party that were otherwise just not going to vote, right? So third parties tend to galvanize people who are just we're just not even going to show up. So it's unfair to say that they're the ones who cost the Democratic Party or whatever, one of the major parties, losing. However, amongst the left, it appears that there are loyalties that are a little bit more divided as far as wanting to see a united left ticket. And I think in this context, support for one is perhaps taking away a little bit from support for others. I know all three parties have been struggling to get onto all the state ballots, and that requires votes. It requires volunteers asking for those votes. My question is, what are your thoughts on splitting up the third party votes? And what was your thought process in leaving the Green Party to go independent, knowing that the Green Party was then going to have to field another candidate?
Yeah, appreciate the query there. One, Brother Daruba is somebody I have deep love and respect for. I go back almost 30 years with him. He put in those 19 years in captivity and incarceration as a political prisoner. And he and I have been in rich conversation since 1990 or so. So when he made the call, I responded immediately, as you saw. And he and I might not agree on everything. We don't agree on God, but well, actually, when he was a member of the party, he was secular. He's a Muslim now, so he actually does believe in God. I said, I want to take that back immediately. I just remember him early on. He was more secular, so I take that immediately. Thank God that Allah came in and had tremendous impact on my brother's life. But I do believe his call, as you know, is for a united front of the left. It's not so much for the campaigns themselves somehow homogenizing, but a united front from the left so that we're able to be as strong as possible as we move prior to election, through the election, and beyond the election. I'm always open to a united front of the left that's based on both principle as well as integrity. You're always going to have people on the left that you have not only disagreements with, but there's folk on the left as well that you begin to lose respect for, because once you see them up close, you recognize, oh, lo and behold, they're not trustworthy, they're not reliable, and so forth and so on. And that was my experience in the Green Party. There's some wonderful people in the Green Party. There's some wonderful individuals in the Green Party. But I became thoroughly convinced that what was asked of me was commitment to a Green Party rather than the movement and the people. For internal debates, for example, that would have taken so much time given limited resources. And then even when we go out and get the votes, it was still very difficult to get the petitions. It was difficult to transfer it to the campaign from the party. So I began to see, no, things are too tight. I'm beginning to feel like a jazz man in a military band. A military band, you got orders from the top. Well, no, that's me. I'm not on anybody's plantation, no matter what the party is. That I've got to be able to be myself across the board. And that means being honest and candid about making connections between critiques of capitalism and critiques of white supremacy. And I make white supremacy very, very crucial and central to my campaign. And we don't have a party in America that makes white supremacy a central issue as it relates to capitalism and imperialism. We just don't. We got anti-racists in all those parties. I mean, Sister Claudia is strong anti-racist. The Green Party got anti-racist, no doubt. But white supremacy is something that sits at the center of what I talk about, because that's my tradition. That's where I come from. That's what King and Malcolm were all about. That's what Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker were all about. And therefore, when I look at Gaza and say on television or on radio, it's settler colonialism, absolutely, no doubt about that. It's the British Empire making the shift to creating this state, and then the American Empire coming in to facilitate its occupation, and now having Biden as war criminal, as genocide denier, as genocide enabler. But at the same time, I accent the white supremacist dimension of it. Everybody knows if those were Europeans, of those with Israelis, there'd be a qualitatively different response around the world. And so we had to be very honest about that. We had to be candid about that. And that's something that I will always do. And therefore, I'm able to do that much easily as someone who's running, as an independent candidate rather than tied to a particular party.
There's a question about your position on U.S.-NATO proxy war in Ukraine. Can you wrap that up in a response as well to kind of tying that into the U.S. funding of Israel and the military and the Israeli military, and your just position on foreign policy and military spending?
Well, I say over and over again, I'm running to head the U.S. empire in order to dismantle the empire. Talking about the 1,800 military units around the world, 130 special operations in countries around the world. And therefore, I'm deeply, deeply critical of American hegemony. NATO has been an extension of American hegemony. Russia itself was promised that there would not be 1 inch budged in NATO. That's what they told Gorbachev. Now, country after country after country, almost 31, now they're on the border. Well, that's provocative. There's no country or empire that will have on their border a enemy country with missiles from their major adversary. If there were Russian missiles or Chinese missiles in Mexico or in Canada, you could rest be assured the United States would blow them to smithereens overnight, just like we saw in 1962 with the missile crisis in Cuba. And so that I view that as provocative. So NATO itself, an extension of American hegemony. So I want to bring that war to a close through diplomatic processes, acknowledging that Russia's a wounded empire. There's no doubt about that. And Russia has its own forms of domination and repression and so forth and so on. I'm not a fan of Putin at all. Not at all. I think he's a gangster in a lot of different ways. But he's also running an empire, a wounded empire, where he has to have some kind of security. And as long as it's provocative, then we're headed toward World War III in terms of nuclear exchange. And that is something that that Biden represents in a very, very ugly way. And it would be the same way in terms of, Taiwan with China, and of course in the Middle East, ending the siege, ending the occupation, and trying to ensure that Palestinians can live a life of equality and dignity.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. West, I did want to give you maybe we can keep this under, if you can keep your response to 90 seconds or 60 seconds.
Sure,
or so.
And you just kind of give me a little sign so I can follow.
That's all right. Okay, I will.
I appreciate it.
Just for you to give some closing remarks, the last co-host had asked about closing argument, and because I'm a public defender, I also appreciate a good closing argument. So if you want to give that to us in 60 to 90 seconds.
Oh, well, no, I just believe, in fact, that we're at a historical moment, an unprecedented historical moment where some serious truth-telling and justice-seeking can take place. And it has to be, I think, by peoples whose voices have a power rooted in a heart and soul based on a longevity of constancy and consistency in speaking on behalf of those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. And there's no doubt that what we've tried to do, I announced now a year ago, and we are on the ascent. We got the 7 states. We're going to be having more states in the coming weeks. It's going to shake things up in a fundamental way. I'm convinced that Biden himself is not even going to be the candidate. I think he's going to drop out. I think he's running out of gas. It's very clear. More and more, we see evidence that he doesn't have both paddles in the water. A certain kind of decline is setting in, a cognitive decline. And there's a chance that the gangster Trump himself could be on the way to jail. So we just don't know. This is in real time, but we have to bear witness and be a witness. That's the important thing. Now, is that within the time limit, though?
I think that is just perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. West. We really appreciate your decades of advocacy for who you just mentioned, and Frantz Fanon calls the wretched of the earth. I really appreciate it on behalf of my clients that I represent, and on behalf of everyone here.
Well, I salute each and every one of you. Stay strong in what you're doing, and we end this in the long run, faithful unto death, in solidarity with our precious Palestinian brothers now and forever and a day.